I did not reject the IMF because I enjoy poverty. I rejected it because poverty is not our destiny. It is a system. And that system just cracked wide open along the banks of the Nile.
Ibrahim Traoré in a speech never aired on Western television. Africa has just witnessed a moment history books will one day either praise or try to forget. Ethiopia has completed the Grand Renaissance Dam, the largest hydroelectric project ever built on African soil. But don't let the concrete and turbines fool you. This isn't just an engineering feat. This is a declaration of independence written in river water funded by farmers and built without permission from the old gatekeepers. For over a century, Egypt claimed dominion over the Nile protected by colonial treaties and international silence. But Ethiopia didn't ask for permission. It didn't borrow from the IMF. It didn't wait for approval from Paris or Washington. It simply built. And in doing so, it may have just changed Africa's future and unsettled the empires that claimed to love her. If you still believe in justice, not just for one nation, but for an entire continent, then stay with us, because what you're about to hear will not be on the evening news. The Nile, a river divided by empire. The Nile is not just a river. It is a lifeline, a myth, a border drawn and redrawn, not by nature but by empire. In 1929 and again in 1959, Britain and then Egypt signed treaties claiming control over the Nile's waters without Ethiopia, the river's source, ever being invited to the table. Imagine hosting a feast only to be told you cannot eat. That has been Ethiopia's position for over a century. Egypt receives over 90% of its fresh water from the Nile and has long viewed any upstream development as an act of aggression. This belief, rooted in colonial logic, became international consensus. The river belonged to those downstream because the empire said so. But Ethiopia never signed those agreements, and when the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam was announced in 2011, it wasn't just the sound of machinery that echoed across the valley. It was the sound of defiance. Ethiopia's dam would be built without loans from the IMF, without Chinese debt, without U.S. contractors. It would be funded by its people teachers, shopkeepers, herders who bought bonds out of duty, not profit. And here's the irony: while the West speaks endlessly of African development, when Ethiopia actually began to develop on its own terms, the world became nervous. Why? Because GERD doesn't just challenge a water treaty. It challenges the architecture of control that has long dictated who in Africa gets to rise and who must remain dependent. Today, as 11 turbines begin to hum across the Blue Nile, Ethiopia is doing something far more radical than making electricity. It is reclaiming authorship over its own story. And in doing so, it's sending a signal from Addis Ababa to Ouagadougou, from the Congo River to the Volta. Africa will no longer wait to be developed. Africa will build. And the river will flow in freedom. No IMF, no World Bank, no billion-dollar donor from Beijing. That's not a headline the West knows what to do with, because the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam wasn't built with debt. It was built with sacrifice. It began with a question whispered in the homes of teachers, shopkeepers, and subsistence farmers. What if we built it ourselves? And then they did. In 2011, when Ethiopia announced the GERD, international analysts smirked. Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries on earth. Building the largest hydroelectric dam on the continent, impossible. But the ruling class forgot one thing. This dam wasn't a government project. It was a people's uprising poured in concrete. Civil servants pledged their salaries. Taxi drivers bought bonds they could barely afford. The diaspora from DC to Dubai sent remittances not to feed relatives, but to feed a revolution. They called it investment. But there would be no dividends, no shares, no golden parachutes. This wasn't capitalism. This was resistance. In rural Tigray and Oromia, farmers who lived hand to mouth scraped together what little they had not for profit, but for pride. They remembered how their rivers had been claimed by outsiders, how development always arrived in foreign suits, holding foreign terms, demanding foreign obedience. Not this time. Every stage of construction became a battlefield. There were no ready-trained engineers for a project of this magnitude. Ethiopia had never built anything of this scale before. Roads had to be carved through rock. Machinery had to be imported often over treacherous terrain, sometimes by donkey. Local youth were trained on site learning, not from textbooks, but from scaffolding rebar and 16-hour shifts in the unforgiving sun. A new generation of engineers, welders, and project managers was born not from foreign scholarships, but from sweat. They are the unspoken legacy of GERD. No statue will be built for them, but they built the foundation of a new Africa. And yet, not all the obstacles were physical. From Cairo came warnings. From Washington came concern. From global media came the usual refrain. Why is Ethiopia being so uncooperative with whom Ethiopia wasn't damming a foreign river? It was damming its own future, taking control of it before someone else did. But power does not surrender easily. And Ethiopia's defiance was read as danger. Not because it harmed anyone, but because it refused to kneel. Threats were made. Meetings held behind closed doors. International lenders withdrew. Still the dam rose. Then came the delays. Years of them. Funding dried up. Supply chains snapped. Political unrest flared at home. Prime ministers changed. Workers went unpaid. Morale faltered. And still, the dam rose. Entire communities were displaced to make room for the reservoir. Promises of compensation came late or not at all. This too was part of the price. Some of it was unjust, but none of it was meaningless. What GERD revealed is what no IMF report can measure: the soul of a people choosing dignity over dependency. The sacrifices were staggering. Thousands of workers spent years in isolation, away from family, from safety, from rest. They did not build this dam in comfort. They built it in defiance. And slowly, from poured concrete and silence, something began to emerge. Power. Literal power, the kind that lights homes and fuels factories. But also symbolic power, the kind that no longer begs to be taken seriously. When the first turbines began to turn and electricity flowed across Ethiopia's grid, it wasn't just about development. It was about memory. Memory of a continent whose rivers were diverted, whose dams were built to export electricity to colonial factories, while their own villages stayed dark. Memory of plans always interrupted by structural adjustment of sovereignty, always mortgaged for aid. GERD was not built just to generate electricity. It was built to generate agency. And it did. Today the dam stands. Its turbines hum. Its reservoir stretches wide and high across the Blue Nile. A monument not to state propaganda, but to people power. And yet, don't expect a Nobel Prize. Don't wait for CNN specials. Don't expect applause from those who once ruled the waters. Because GERD is not just an engineering marvel. It is a rupture in colonial logic, in debt dependency, in the belief that Africans can't build unless someone else writes the check. The people of Ethiopia proved otherwise, and for those who still doubt the proof, now hums at 6,450 megawatts. It wasn't about water. That's what they won't tell you on the BBC. What rattled Cairo? What unnerved Washington? What triggered countless summits and veiled threats? It wasn't the dam's concrete wall. It was the symbolic one. GERD wasn't dangerous because it blocks the Nile. It was dangerous because it blocks the old rules. For over a century, Egypt claimed supreme authority over the Nile, upheld by colonial-era treaties, signed by Britain, not by Africa. According to these documents, Ethiopia, the source of 85% of the Nile's waters, was to remain silent. They called it diplomacy. But let's speak plainly, it was control. So when Ethiopia laid the first stone of the Grand Renaissance Dam, it wasn't violating a river. It was violating a hierarchy, one that placed Cairo's comfort above Addis Ababa's dignity. And that's when the war of words began. Egypt's media warned of existential threats. Its generals hinted at military options. Its diplomats stormed international forums demanding a legally binding agreement, one that would freeze Ethiopia's development in exchange for stability. But here's the truth. The global press never framed honestly. Ethiopia had never proposed to stop the Nile. It proposed to generate electricity, then release the same water downstream. They called it a run-of-river dam designed to preserve flow while ending blackouts. Still, Egypt bristled. Because GERD didn't threaten supply, it threatened supremacy. To a Western audience, it might sound petty. But imagine this: if Texas built a solar farm and Canada demanded veto power because it might alter the shade, would that fly? Now ask why that logic gets flipped when it's Africa. Why is it when a European nation asserts its energy independence, it's applauded, but when Ethiopia does it, the world panics? This is not about water. It's about a region where one nation was always allowed to develop and the others were told to wait. Egypt, long backed by US military aid and geopolitical leverage, is used to calling the shots. Its threats aren't just diplomatic, they're militarized. Jets, bases, alliances. In 2020, talks between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan collapsed after pressure from Washington tilted the table. The US proposed a compromise. Ethiopia rejected it because it would have given Cairo near veto power over how quickly GERD could fill. That's when the smearing began. Suddenly, Ethiopia wasn't portrayed as ambitious, but reckless. Not sovereign, but stubborn. Even as Ethiopia endured internal strife, global headlines rarely covered the dam's peaceful intent. Instead, they focused on regional tensions, a euphemism for "don't upset Egypt." But this is where the deeper truth emerges. GERD isn't just about Ethiopia. It's about what happens when an African nation refuses to play by post-colonial rules. It's about what happens when a former subject starts drawing its own maps of energy, of economics, of dignity. And for many across Africa, that's what made GERD not just a dam, but a mirror showing how deeply the continent's right to develop is still policed, not by treaties, but by fear. Fear that if Ethiopia succeeds without permission, others might try. That's the real threat. Not turbines, not evaporation, not downstream flow, but contagion. The spread of a dangerous idea that Africans can fund, build, and operate mega projects on their own terms. That's why GERD had to be called controversial. That's why the narrative had to be twisted into conflict. Because the alternative was unthinkable, that Africa no longer needs permission. Slips to prosper, and so the pressure mounted. Backroom deals, satellite surveillance, media spin. But Ethiopia did not blink. Even as Western media framed the story through water wars, Ethiopia kept repeating a simple phrase: "We have the right to light our homes." Those are not the words of a threat. They are the words of a nation tired of the dark, literal, and political. And now that the turbines are spinning, a new fear spreads among the old order. That GERD will work. That lights will stay on. That exports will begin. And that Ethiopia, not France, not China, not the IMF, will become the model for African infrastructure. Because this dam is not just holding back water, it's releasing something far more powerful. A new African logic. When the water finally pooled behind the concrete colossus, it did more than generate power. It generated movement. From Nairobi to Niamey, from Kinshasa to Cape Coast, the completion of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam whispered something bold into the ears of African youth. We can do it too, because GERD is not just an Ethiopian achievement. It's a breach in the psychological dam that once held back an entire continent's belief in itself. Already the ripple effects are visible. In Kenya, conversations have shifted from foreign partnerships to local capability. Youth-led energy startups are invoking GERD as proof that independence isn't a fantasy, it's a formula. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré speaks not only of food sovereignty, but of energy liberation. Building solar farms in rural provinces, calling on engineers from Ghana and Mali to bypass the IMF's carrot stick traps. Djibouti, a nation often seen as a military host for foreign powers, is negotiating direct power imports from Ethiopia, not from France, not from the US, but from its African neighbor. Even Sudan, entangled in internal crises, is reassessing its long-term energy dependence. The calculation is shifting. Instead of pleading for Western contracts, why not partner with fellow Africans? That shift terrifies old powers, because every kilowatt that flows through an African-built grid weakens the grip of external gatekeepers. Every contract that bypasses the Bretton Woods system chips at the illusion of necessity that Africa must borrow to build. GERD has become shorthand for an emerging philosophy: develop with dignity, power without permission, progress without paternalism. And while most Western newsrooms focused on regional tension, something quieter, deeper, and more dangerous to the status quo was unfolding. African audiences were watching. They watched as Ethiopia refused to beg. They watched as no US company built the turbines. They watched as no French bank underwrote the cement. They watched and they learned. That learning is spreading. And for entrenched interests, whether they wear suits in Brussels or uniforms in Camp Lemonnier, it is destabilizing. Because the old game was simple: let Africa plan, but not build. Let Africa hope, but not finance. Let Africa vote, but not own. GERD flips that game. It is built, it is owned, and now it produces. And here lies the twist. No think tank predicted Ethiopia is becoming an energy exporter. Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, all negotiating for a share of the surplus electricity. That means Ethiopia holds leverage, not as a donor darling, but as a regional provider. Energy, like water, is power. And whoever controls the switchboard controls the future. For the first time in modern history, that control is shifting not from one empire to another, but from the margins to the middle. From a forgotten plateau in East Africa, Ethiopia is lighting up more than homes. It's lighting up the path. But with light comes shadow. Some leaders fear this shift, fear that their people will ask, if Ethiopia can do it, why not us? If they rejected the IMF and still succeeded, why are we still paying debt on roads we never finished? So, in many capitals, silence is the strategy. Don't celebrate GERD too loudly. Don't mention it in speeches. Don't let the people connect the dots between this dam and their own unrealized potential. But the dots are connecting anyway. From WhatsApp groups in Lagos to student unions in Abidjan, the conversation is changing. Not who will help us, but what are we waiting for? And that's the true consequence of GERD. It's not just a dam, it's a demand for sovereignty, for boldness, for the right to imagine, to build, to power a future shaped not by colonial memories, but by continental purpose. On the eastern edge of the continent, turbines hum on the Blue Nile. In the west, soldiers march under a new flag, red, green, and gold, stitched with defiance. Two scenes, two languages, two geographies, but one war. Not a war with bullets, but with blueprints. Not fought in trenches, but in boardrooms, fields, and power plants. This is the war for African sovereignty, and GERD and the AES alliance are its twin fronts. Let's connect the lines. Ethiopia, by completing the GERD without foreign debt, without external oversight, declared war on dependency itself. It said, "We will not borrow what we can build." Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, did the same but with land and grain. It said, "We will not import what we can grow." Across Mali and Niger, similar echoes emerged. These were not isolated rebellions. They were coordinated exits from the CFA franc, from ECOWAS, from the tight grip of the French Treasury and NATO's shadow. If GERD was a revolution in infrastructure, AES is a revolution in governance. Both ask the same question: who owns Africa's future? GERD did not need military tanks to shake the empire. It used dams engineers and pride. But the response from old powers was nearly identical. Pressure isolation warnings dressed as diplomacy when Burkina Faso rejected French troops, and IMF dictates sanctions followed. When Ethiopia refused to bow on GERD negotiations, threats of instability loomed. But here's what Washington and Paris failed to calculate. Neither Ethiopia nor the AES nations are alone anymore. Because GERD proved that infrastructure built from within creates not just megawatts, it creates morale. And morale is contagious. Let's talk numbers. The GERD's full capacity is 6,450 megawatts, enough to power over 100 million homes. AES countries combined have less than 4,000 megawatts of consistent, reliable energy. See the opportunity. An east-west energy corridor, African-built, African-owned, African-supplied. GERD isn't just an Ethiopian asset. It is a continental bargaining chip. And AES knows this. Quiet discussions are already happening. Burkina Faso exploring energy trade via Ethiopia-Sudan-Chad lines. Niger seeking hydropower access that bypasses former French-aligned systems. This is the silent architecture of a post-colonial Bloc 1, not based on ideology, but on shared rejection of external control. Meanwhile, look at the IMF. It tried to court both Ethiopia and Burkina Faso with similar tactics: debt relief in exchange for policy concessions, support packages tied to foreign contractors, development assistance conditional on privatization. Both said no. Both paid the price and kept building anyway. Now the world watches as their gamble begins to pay off. Burkina Faso, once a food importer, is exporting rice to neighbors. Ethiopia, once energy-starved, is selling electricity abroad. What binds them? Sovereignty over resources, rejection of imposed dependence, faith in their people. And here's the threat the West cannot contain. If this model spreads, it makes the old one obsolete. If African nations start building together not through NGOs, but through strategic cooperation, then the post-World War II architecture crumbles. The Bretton Woods institutions become irrelevant. The UN Security Council becomes exposed. The Paris Club becomes a museum exhibit. And for the first time since decolonization, Africa would not just be developing, it would be designing. That's why GERD matters. That's why AES matters. They are not just events. They are precedents. They say, the time of waiting is over. The age of asking is done. The era of building has begun. And this shift is not just technical or economic, it is moral. Because it asks, why must African nations beg to light their homes or feed their children? Why must the continent richest in resources be poorest in infrastructure? Who benefits when Africa remains fractured, indebted, and obedient? These are not new questions, but now finally we have new answers. And they are being written in megawatts and rice fields, in gold refineries, and school blueprints in shared resistance and silent cooperation. GERD and AES are two sides of the same coin. One powers the grid, the other powers the people. Together they are building the foundation of something the empires never planned for: a self-reliant Africa. You remember Selma? You remember Vietnam? You remember when dissent wasn't treason? It was testimony. So ask yourself now, in the quiet of your conscience, why does the world applaud freedom when it marches westward, but panics when it flows upstream from Africa? When Ethiopia dammed the Nile, it did not stop water. It stopped the cycle. The cycle of waiting, of begging, of building someone else's vision. When Burkina Faso expelled French troops, it did not reject the world. It rejected the leash. Yet these acts, peaceful, sovereign, self-funded, are labeled threats. Not because they destabilize nations, but because they disturb the order. Whose order? The same order that once called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. The same order that bombed Libya and called it liberation. The same order that keeps Africa rich in minerals and poor in memory. But memory is rising. In the hum of turbines across the Nile, in the footsteps of farmers walking their own land again, in the silence of youth who are done asking for permission. So to the elders in America who once marched for justice, your time is not over. Your voice still matters. Ask your leaders why they fund those who fear Africa's independence. Ask them, why are African rivers only allowed to flow if someone else owns the dam? Because in the end, this isn't about water. It's about whether the world is ready to let Africa rise. If you ever believed in justice, then now is the time to remember why.